On July 24, 1915, a ship carrying over 2,500 passengers capsized and killed 844 people. More deaths than the Titanic, more than the Lusitania. But here's what makes this different. The ship didn't sink in the middle of the ocean. It capsized 20 feet from shore, in downtown Chicago, in broad daylight, on a calm summer morning, in 20 feet of water. People on the dock watched helplessly as hundreds drowned within arm's reach. And yet, almost nobody knows this story. Welcome to the Unsaid. Today, we're talking about the deadliest disaster in Chicago's history, a tragedy that killed more people than the Great Chicago Fire, a catastrophe that wiped out entire families in minutes. And the question isn't just what happened that morning, it's why America forgot. Saturday, July 24th, 1915. It was supposed to be a perfect day. Western Electric Company had chartered 5 passenger steamers to take employees and their families across Lake Michigan to Michigan City, Indiana for the annual company picnic. By 6:30 that morning, over 5,000 people crowded the docks along the Chicago River. Workers in their best summer clothes, children excited for a day at the beach, young couples on one of their first dates. The Eastland was the first ship scheduled to depart, and it was the nicest one. Sleek, fast, glamorous, known as the Speed Queen of the Great Lakes. Passengers rushed to board. They wanted the best spots on deck for the journey across the lake. What they didn't know was that the Eastland had a dark history. For 12 years, the ship had been plagued by stability problems. It had nearly capsized multiple times. In 1904, it listed so severely with 3,000 passengers aboard that officials lowered its capacity. In 1913, a naval architect warned in writing, unless structural defects are remedied to prevent listing, there may be a serious accident. Nothing was done. By 7:10 a.m., the Eastland had reached its legal capacity, 2,500 passengers. Among them were families who would never make it to the picnic. George Sindelar, a foreman at Western Electric, his wife, Josephine, their 5 children, ages 15, 12, 9, 6, and 3. All 7 Sindelars were on board, dressed in their Sunday best. The Lemke sisters, Emily, Wilhelmina, and Elizabeth, boarded together, laughing about the day ahead. Marie Clark carried her 9-month-old daughter Alice onto the ship. And there was a red-haired boy, 6 years old, whose name we don't know. He would become the most famous survivor for a reason you won't expect. At 7:10 a.m., the gangplank was pulled in. The ship was full. And then, something started to go wrong. The Eastland began to list. First to the starboard side, away from the dock. The crew adjusted the ballast tanks, compartments filled with water to balance the ship. The Eastland righted itself. Then it began listing again, this time to port, toward the dock. At 7:16 a.m., the list grew more severe. 10 degrees, then 15. Dishes started sliding off shelves in the galley. A piano on the promenade deck slayed across the floor, nearly crushing 2 women. The crew ordered passengers on the upper decks to move to the starboard side to balance the ship, but the deck was too steep, too slippery from the morning rain. Passengers couldn't comply. At 7:27 a.m., the Eastland listed 25 degrees to port. Water poured in through open gangways. The stokers in the boiler room abandoned their posts and ran for the upper decks. On the dock, warehouse workers along the river began shouting, "Look out, she's tipping!" And then at exactly 7:28 a.m., the Eastland rolled over. Not slowly, not gradually. In 2 minutes, the ship went from listing 25 degrees to lying completely on its side in the Chicago River. 844 people were about to die, 20 feet from shore. The Eastland came to rest in 20 feet of water, lying on its side like a beached whale. Passengers on the upper decks were thrown into the river. Hundreds of heads bobbed in the water. People screamed. Children called for their parents. But the real horror was happening below deck. Inside the ship, over 1,000 passengers had been trapped when it rolled. They were crushed against the walls, drowned in the flooding compartments, suffocated in pockets of air that quickly ran out. The ship's single lifeboat floated free. Inside was one survivor, a red-haired boy, 6 years old, who had been plucked from the water and tossed into the boat by a stranger. He was the only person that lifeboat saved. The tugboat Kenosha, moored nearby, immediately positioned itself against the Eastland's hull, creating a bridge. Passengers trapped on the overturned ship leaped to safety. Employees from riverside warehouses threw crates and barrels into the water for drowning passengers to grab onto. Divers plunged into the murky river searching for survivors, but the Eastland's steel hull trapped hundreds inside. Rescuers could hear tapping from inside the ship, faint cries for help, but they couldn't reach them. Someone called for acetylene torches. Workers began cutting through the hull. They managed to pull out 40 people alive, but for most, it was already too late. Police divers pulled body after body from the water. One diver broke down, screaming in rage at the senselessness of it. The city sent workers with a large net to the mouth of the river to prevent bodies from washing into Lake Michigan. By afternoon, temporary morgues had been set up in buildings along the river. The 2nd Regiment Armory became the main morgue. Over 700 bodies were laid out in rows on the floor. Families moved through, searching for loved ones. The coroner's physician, Dr. Joseph Springer, examined each body. By pinching the throat, he could determine whether they had drowned or suffocated. Most had suffocated. 22 entire families were wiped out, parents and all their children gone. The Sindelar family, all 7 of them, were found dead. Their bodies were placed in white caskets and stacked on a Model T Ford for the funeral procession. The Lemke sisters, Marie Clark and baby Alice. Hundreds of names, hundreds of families shattered. Wednesday, July 28th became known as the Day of Funerals. Chicago was a city of grief. There weren't enough hearses. Marshall Field and Company provided 39 trucks to transport the dead. 52 gravediggers working 12-hour days couldn't keep up. Nearly 150 graves had to be dug at the Bohemian National Cemetery alone. By the end of that day, almost 700 Eastland victims had been buried. So what caused the Eastland to capsize? The answer is as tragic as it is ironic. The Titanic. After the Titanic sank in 1912, Congress passed the La Follette-Siemens Act, which required all passenger ships to carry enough lifeboats and life rafts for every passenger. It was meant to save lives. But for ships like the Eastland, ships with shallow drafts and known stability problems, the extra weight on the upper decks was catastrophic. Before 1915, the Eastland carried 6 lifeboats. After the law, it carried 11 lifeboats and 37 life rafts, over 7,000 pounds of additional weight, all on the top deck. During the debate over the bill, the general manager of a Great Lakes shipping company warned that some vessels would turn turtle if you attempted to navigate them with this additional weight on the upper decks. Legislators ignored the warning. President Woodrow Wilson signed the bill into law. The Eastland disaster was the unintended consequence. But there's more. In 1915, just months before the disaster, the Eastland had concrete poured into its lower decks to repair rotting wood. several tons of concrete, raising the center of gravity even higher. A ship's stability is measured by something called metacentric height, the distance between upright and the maximum angle before capsizing. Normal practice for a passenger ship, 2 to 4 feet. The Eastland's metacentric height on July 24, 1915? 4 inches. It was a disaster waiting to happen. In August 1915, 6 men were charged with manslaughter and criminal carelessness. Captain Harry Pedersen, the ship's captain, Joseph Erickson, the chief engineer, and 4 company executives from the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company, which owned the Eastland. The charges were serious: operating a ship in substandard condition, loading it beyond safe capacity, hiring incompetent crew, failing to warn passengers when disaster was imminent. The case was moved to federal court in Michigan, where the company was based, and where they hoped for a friendlier jury. The defense? Clarence Darrow, one of the most famous lawyers in America. On March 19, 1916, the verdict was delivered. Not guilty, on all charges, for all defendants. The judge ruled there wasn't enough evidence to prove they knew of and ignored problems with the ship. Nobody was held accountable for 844 deaths. Civil lawsuits followed. Families sued for damages. But in 1935, 20 years after the disaster, an appeals court threw out every case. The Eastland victims received nothing. And here's where the story becomes truly unbelievable. On August 14, 1915, just 3 weeks after the disaster, the Eastland was raised from the river. It was still structurally sound. So in 1917, it was sold to the United States Navy. The ship that killed 844 people was refurbished, renamed the USS Wilmette, and converted into a gunboat. It served as a training vessel on the Great Lakes through both World Wars. The same ship, the same hull, just a new name. It wasn't scrapped until after World War II. So here's the question. Why do we all know about the Titanic, but not the Eastland? The Titanic killed 1,517 people. The Eastland killed 844, and it happened just 3 years later. The Titanic sank in the middle of the Atlantic. The Eastland capsized in the heart of a major American city with thousands of witnesses. So why is one a cultural touchstone and the other forgotten? Here's what was left unsaid. The Eastland victims were working-class immigrants, Czech, Polish, Hungarian families, factory workers, not wealthy first-class passengers in evening gowns. The disaster happened on July 24, 1915. World War I was raging in Europe. American newspapers were dominated by war coverage. The Eastland got a few days of headlines, then vanished. And here's the darker truth. Survivors didn't want to talk about it. For decades, families kept silent. Children who survived felt guilty. Parents who lost children couldn't bear to speak their names. Libby Hruby was 10 years old when the Eastland capsized. Her sister pulled her from the water. She survived. In 1995, at 84 years old, she attended a memorial and broke down in tears. Very little was spoken about it, she said, but it's something that everybody should remember. The last known survivor, Marion Eichholz, died in 2014 at the age of 102. She was 3 years old on July 24, 1915. Her father grabbed her in his arms and jumped into the river. They survived. She carried the memory for 99 years, And when she died, the last living voice of the Eastland disaster fell silent. Today, there's a small plaque near the Clark Street Bridge in Chicago. Most people walk past without noticing. Students researching the disaster in the 1980s were shocked to find it missing from history textbooks. They fought to have the plaque installed. And even now, a century later, most Americans have never heard of the Eastland.
So why does this matter? Because the Eastland disaster isn't just a forgotten tragedy. It's a reminder that history is written by those who have the power to tell it. The Titanic had wealthy victims, famous names, a story that fit a narrative of hubris and heroism. The Eastland had immigrant workers, bureaucratic failure, and a truth nobody wanted to face: that safety regulations meant to save lives had made a disaster inevitable. It's easier to remember a ship that sank in the ocean than one that capsized at the dock. It's easier to mythologize tragedy when it happens far away. But 844 people died 20 feet from shore in broad daylight because a ship everyone knew was dangerous was allowed to operate anyway. And for 100 years, their story has been unsaid. Until now.
This has been The Unsaid. If you want to learn more about the Eastland disaster, I've linked sources in the description, including the Eastland Disaster Historical Society and archived testimony from survivors. Some tragedies are remembered, others are buried. We're here to bring them back. Until next time, stay curious.